The throne room of Station Valthrix stretched out like the inside of a cathedral made from black glass and living light. And at its center sat Queen Zirvethis of the Sithrani Dominion upon a seat carved from the bones of a creature no human had ever seen. Her body rose nearly 8 feet tall when she stood, covered in dark purple chitin that gleamed like polished armor under the floating lights that drifted through the chamber, like lazy fireflies. And her forearms rested on the sides of her throne with the casual confidence of a predator who had never known defeat. Around her stood ambassadors from 17 different species, all gathered to witness what the Sithrani called a formal evaluation of the newest species to enter galactic politics. Humanity. The Queen had grown tired of hearing about these soft little creatures from the blue planet near the edge of the spiral arm. And she had grown especially tired of hearing how they kept winning diplomatic victories through methods no one could quite explain. They had no psychic abilities like the Mentori, and they possessed no superior technology like the Vorn Collective. And their bodies were fragile bags of water and calcium that should break at the slightest pressure. Yet somehow they kept surviving. Somehow they kept spreading. Somehow they kept making friends with species who had no business befriending. Such weak and short-lived things. Queen Zirvethis had decided it was time to put humanity in its proper place. And that place was on its knees before her throne. The proving was an ancient Sithrani tradition that dated back thousands of years to the time when our people first crawled out of the volcanic caves of their homeworld and began to conquer the stars. And it was a simple thing really, a series of trials designed to test the body and the mind and the spirit. No species had ever passed the proving on their first attempt. And most species required 3 or 4 attempts before they earned the respect of the Sithrani. Some species never passed at all. And those species learned to bow when Sithrani vessels entered their systems. The Queen had sent word to the human diplomatic vessel that she required a champion to represent their species. And she had been very specific about which human she wanted, not the tall marine captain with the scarred face and the cold eyes, who stood guard outside the ambassador's quarters, not the fierce female soldier who had apparently killed something called a bear with her bare hands during a survival exercise on Earth. No. Queen Zirvethis had chosen the quiet man who worked in the back of the ship, moving boxes and tracking inventory. His name was Marcus Cole, and he was a logistics sergeant with no notable achievements in combat and no special training in diplomacy. And he was exactly the kind of human the Queen believed represented their species best, weak and unremarkable and easy to break. The doors to the throne room opened with a sound like distant thunder, and a small group of humans walked in wearing their simple gray uniforms with the blue planet patch on their shoulders. Ambassador Chun led the group with her head held high and her face carefully neutral. And behind her walked Captain Torres and 2 Marines who moved like they expected a fight. And at the back of the group walked Marcus Cole. He was not a large man by human standards, and he stood perhaps 5 feet and 10 inches with a build that suggested he spent more time carrying boxes than lifting weights. His hair was brown and cut short, and his face was the kind of face that belonged to someone you would forget 5 minutes after meeting them. His eyes were the only interesting thing about him, and they were a pale gray color that reminded the Queen of Ash. The human stopped at the appropriate distance from the throne, and Ambassador Chun began to speak in the formal manner that diplomats used when they wanted to sound important. Great Queen Zirvethis of the Sithrani Dominion, we thank you for this opportunity to demonstrate the worth of humanity to your august presence and to the assembled representatives of the galactic community. The Queen waved one of her 4 hands dismissively. Spare me the pleasantries, Ambassador, and bring forward your champion so that the proving may begin. Ambassador Chun's jaw tightened slightly, but she stepped aside, and gestured for Marcus to come. Forward, the logistics sergeant walked to the front of the group with his hands clasped behind his back and his expression completely calm. And he stopped at the edge of the ceremonial circle that had been painted on the floor in front of the throne. "You are Marcus Cole of Earth?" the Queen asked, and her voice echoed through the chamber like the rumble of a volcano preparing to erupt. "Yes, ma'am." Marcus replied in a voice that was neither loud nor soft. "You understand that you have been chosen to represent your entire species in the proving, and that your performance will determine how the Sithrani Dominion views humanity for generations to come." "I understand. And you accept this responsibility willingly?" Marcus shrugged with one shoulder in a gesture that made several Sithrani advisors hiss with disapproval at his casual manner. "Sure," he said. "When do we start?" Queen Zirvethis felt her mandibles click together in anticipation, and she leaned forward on her throne to study this small, soft creature who stood before her without any apparent fear or respect. He was perfect. He was exactly what she had expected from humanity, and he would break quickly under the trial she had prepared. And when he broke, the entire galaxy would see that humans were nothing special after all. "The first trial will begin at dawn tomorrow," the Queen announced, "and you will face the crucible of flames, where your will shall be tested against the heat of a dying star." She expected him to flinch or to ask questions or to show some sign of concern. Marcus Cole simply nodded. "Sounds good," he said. "Is there somewhere I can get dinner first? The food on our ship is pretty terrible, and I heard this station has a decent cafeteria." The throne room fell absolutely silent. No one had ever responded to the announcement of the Crucible of Flames by asking about dinner. Queen Zirvethis stared at the human for a long moment, and somewhere deep in her chest, she felt the first tiny flicker of uncertainty. She crushed it immediately. This human was nothing, and tomorrow she would prove it to everyone. "You may go," she said coldly. "Enjoy your meal, human. For maybe your last." Marcus Cole smiled politely and turned to walk back to his group. "Thanks," he called over his shoulder. "See you tomorrow then?" As the humans left the throne room, one of the Queen's advisors leaned close to her ear. "My Queen, are you certain about this one? He seems rather calm for someone who just agreed to face the proving." Zirvethis watched the doors close behind the departing humans, and her mandibles spread in what passed for a smile among her people. "That is not calm," she said with absolute certainty. "That is ignorance, and tomorrow he will learn the difference." She was wrong. The arena beneath Station Valthrix was built into the belly of an asteroid that had been hollowed out centuries ago, and its walls were lined with seats carved from stone that rose up in circles like the inside of a bowl. Thousands of spectators had gathered to watch the proving, and their voices filled the space with a constant hum of conversation, in dozens of different languages as translation. Devices worked overtime to keep everyone informed. At the center of the arena stood a circular chamber made of transparent material that could withstand temperatures hot enough to melt steel. And inside that chamber were two raised platforms separated by about 20 feet of empty space. Queen Zirvethis stood on one platform wearing ceremonial armor that covered her chitin in plates of gold and black. And she looked magnificent in the way that a volcano looks magnificent right before it destroys everything around it on. The other platform stood Marcus Cole, wearing the same gray uniform he had worn yesterday. And he looked like a man waiting for a bus. The rules of the Crucible of Flames were simple as the announcer explained to the crowd. The chamber would heat up gradually over the course of an hour, and the two opponents would face each other without moving or looking away. And the first one to step back or close their eyes or show any sign of submission would lose. The Sithrani had evolved on a world covered in active volcanoes and rivers of flowing lava, and their bodies were designed to thrive in temperatures that would cook most other species alive. This trial was supposed to be impossible for anyone except the Sithrani to win. And that was exactly why Queen Zirvethis had chosen it for the first test. She wanted to break this human. Quickly and completely, the chamber sealed with a hiss, and the heating elements hidden in the walls began to glow with a soft orange light. And Marcus Cole clasped his hands behind his back and looked across the space at the Queen with an expression of mild interest. "Good luck," he said. Rivis did not respond because responding to an opponent during the proving was considered a sign of weakness, and she simply stared at him with her compound eyes reflecting the growing heat around them. The temperature climbed 35 degrees Celsius, and Marcus shifted his weight slightly from one foot to the other. 50 degrees, and small beads of sweat began to form on his forehead. 60 degrees, and his gray uniform started to show dark patches where the sweat was soaking through. The crowd murmured with anticipation, because surely this was it. And surely the weak human would yield any moment now. And several Sithrani in the audience made gestures of approval at their queen's obvious superiority. 70 degrees, and Marcus wiped his forehead with his sleeve, but his eyes never left the Queen. 80 degrees, and his skin had turned an angry red color, and his breathing had become slow and deliberate, like a man consciously controlling each breath. Queen Zirvethis felt the heat against her chitin like a warm bath, and she could have stayed in this temperature for days without any discomfort. And she waited for the human to break 90 degrees, and Marcus Cole was still standing. His face was flushed and dripping with sweat, and his uniform was completely soaked through. But his feet had not moved, and his eyes had not closed, and his expression had not changed from that look of mild interest that infuriated the Queen more than any defiance could have. 100 degrees Celsius, the temperature at which water boiled, the temperature at which human flesh should cook. And Marcus Cole opened his mouth and spoke. "You know what this reminds me of?" His voice was rough from the heat, but clear enough for everyone to hear. And Queen Zirvethis felt her mandibles twitch with surprise, because no one talked during the crucible. No one. "Back when I was 18 years old," Marcus continued as if he was chatting with a friend over drinks, "I went through basic training at Fort Huachuca in Arizona. And that was during July, which is the hottest month in that part of the country. 105 degrees. Our drill sergeant was a man named Reyes, and he was about 5 feet tall and made entirely of anger and disappointment. And he decided that we needed to do push-ups in the parking lot at 2 in the afternoon on the hottest day of the summer. 110 degrees. The asphalt was so hot you could see the heat waves coming off it. And we had to put our hands flat on that surface and do 50 push-ups while Sergeant Reyes walked around telling us how worthless we were. 115 degrees. 3 guys passed out and had to go to medical. And I got blisters on my palms that took 2 weeks to heal. And when we were done, Sergeant Reyes looked at us and said that if we could survive that, then we could survive anything. The Queen stared at this human who was slowly cooking alive in front of her and telling her a story about doing exercises in a parking lot. And she felt something she had not felt in over 200 years of life confusion. 120 degrees Celsius, and Marcus Cole was still talking. "The funny thing is that Reyes was right," he said, "because after that, everything else seemed pretty easy by comparison. And I learned that the body can take a lot more punishment than the mind wants to believe." He smiled at the Queen with cracked lips and red-rimmed eyes. "So yeah, this reminds me of that. Except at least here, I don't have anyone yelling at me about how my mother would be ashamed of my push-up form." Queen Zirvethis felt something shift inside her chest. This was not possible. This human should be dead or dying, or at the very least screaming in agony. But instead he was standing there making jokes about his military training while his skin blistered, and his body temperature rose to levels that should have shut down his brain. She looked at his eyes, and she saw something there that she had never seen in any opponent before. Not defiance, not hatred, not even courage in the traditional sense. It was something else, something that looked almost like amusement, like he found this whole situation funny somehow, like the pain was just an inconvenience that he had decided to ignore because he had better things to think. About 125 degrees. The Queen's chitin was starting to feel warm now. Not uncomfortable, but definitely present. And she realized with growing horror that she would have to push the temperature even higher if she wanted to break this human hand. She was not certain anymore that higher temperatures would work. 130 degrees, and Marcus Cole was still standing and still staring at her with those ash-gray eyes that seemed to be asking her a question. Are we done yet? Queen Zirvethis felt her foot move backward before she consciously decided to move it, and she froze in place as she realized what she had just done. She had stepped back. She had shown submission. She had lost. The chamber began to cool immediately as the trial ended, and the crowd erupted in chaos as thousands of spectators tried to process what they had just witnessed. The undefeated queen of the Sithrani Dominion had yielded to a human logistics sergeant in the crucible of flames. Marcus Cole wobbled slightly as the doors to the chamber opened and cooler air rushed in, and his crewmates rushed forward to catch him before he fell. Did I win? He asked in a voice that was barely more than a whisper. Captain Torres looked at him with an expression of pure disbelief. Yeah, Cole? You won. Marcus smiled with his burned and blistered face. Cool. Can someone get me some water? I'm really thirsty. Across the chamber, Queen Zirvethis stood frozen on her platform as her advisors rushed to attend her, and she stared at the human being carried away by his friends with an emotion that burned hotter than any fire. Fury, pure and absolute fury. This was not over. The private chambers of Queen Zirvethis aboard her flagship were designed to intimidate anyone foolish enough to enter them, and the walls were decorated with the skulls of champions she had defeated and the banners of nations she had conquered. But tonight those trophies brought her no comfort. She stood in front of a massive window that looked out at the stars, and her four hands were clenched into fists that could crush stone. And behind her, a group of advisors stood in terrified silence, waiting for her rage to find a target. Leave me, she said in a voice that was barely more than a whisper. Advisors fled so quickly that they nearly trampled each other in their rush to exit, and the door sealed behind them with a sound like a tomb closing alone at last. Queen Zirvethis let out a roar of fury that echoed through the ship and made crew members 3 decks away flinch with fear. She had lost. She had lost to a human. She had lost to a human who told jokes while he was cooking alive. Memory of that moment played over and over in her mind like a wound that would not stop bleeding. And every time she remembered the look on his face, she felt her rage grow stronger. He had not been afraid. He had not been defiant. He had been amused, like she was nothing more than an inconvenience to be tolerated, like the sacred trial of her ancestors was just a minor annoyance on his way to dinner. She smashed her fist into the window, hard enough to crack the inner layer of transparent material. And the pain in her knuckles felt good, because at least it was something she could understand. Computer, she snapped. Bring up all available information on the human called Marcus Cole. A holographic display flickered to life in front of her, and began scrolling through data that her intelligence officers had gathered from human networks and diplomatic databases. Marcus James Cole, born 34 Earth years ago in a region called Nevada, in the nation called the United States of America, enlisted in the human military. At age 18, served in something called the Army Quartermaster Corps, which apparently involved moving supplies and tracking inventory. Notable combat experience: no medals for bravery, no special training or augmentation, nothing. that should have allowed him to do what he did today. The Queen scrolled through his service record with growing frustration because there had to be something. And there had to be some explanation for how this ordinary man had endured temperatures that should have killed him 10 times over. And then she found it. Kepler. Station incident, year 2187. She opened the file and read about a cargo accident aboard a human space station where a bay door had malfunctioned and opened without warning. And Marcus Cole had been inside that bay when the air rushed out into the vacuum of space. He had survived for 4 minutes without a suit. 4 minutes in the cold and airless void of space with no protection except his own body and his own will to live. The rescue team had found him unconscious and barely alive, with burst blood vessels in his eyes and frostbite on his exposed skin. And the medical report said he should have died within the first 30 seconds, but he did not die. He woke up in the medical bay and asked when he could get back to work. And when the doctors told him he needed psychological counseling to process the trauma, he said no thank you because he had boxes to move. The Queen stared at this report for a long time. She had assumed that the quiet ones were weak because in Sithrani culture the quiet ones were usually the ones who had given up. And the strong ones were loud and aggressive and demanded attention. But humans were different. Human quietness did not mean weakness. Human quietness meant they had already survived things that should have broken them, and they had decided that making noise about it was a waste of energy. She thought about the way Marcus had stood in the crucible and told stories about his training, like he was passing time at a social gathering. And she realized that he had not been ignoring the pain. He had been compartmentalizing it, had been putting the pain in a box in his mind and setting it aside because he had decided it was not important enough to bother him right now. This was not a skill that could be taught. This was something that grew inside a species that had spent its entire evolutionary history being hunted and starved and frozen and burned by a planet that seemed determined to kill them. Humans did not evolve to be the strongest or the fastest or the smartest. They evolved to be the most stubborn. They evolved to keep going when every rational calculation said they should stop. They evolved to survive out of spite. Queen Zirvethis felt her fury begin to transform into something else. And it took her a moment to recognize the emotion, because she had not felt it in centuries. Respect. She crushed that feeling immediately, because she refused to respect the species that kept their champion working in logistics and moving boxes around a ship. She refused to respect a species that treated the sacred proving like a chore to be completed before dinner. She refused to accept that she had lost fairly. Computer, she said, contact my senior advisors and tell them to prepare the remaining trials. The computer chirped in acknowledgement. And tell them that we will be accelerating the schedule because we will complete all remaining trials within the next rotation. A pause from the computer. My queen. That is against protocol. And the standard waiting period between trials is meant to allow the challenger to recover. I do not care about protocol, Zirvethis snarled. And if the human needs time to recover, then perhaps he should not have entered the proving in the first place. She turned away from the window and walked toward her armor stand, where her ceremonial combat gear waited for the final trial. This human thinks he can embarrass me in front of the entire galactic community and face no consequences. But he is wrong. She picked up her helmet and stared at her reflection in its polished surface. By the time I am finished with Marcus Cole, every species in this galaxy will understand what happens to those who humiliate the Sithrani. She placed the helmet on her head and felt the familiar weight settle onto her shoulders. He will break. She said the words with absolute certainty. But somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered a question she did not want to answer. What if he does not? She ignored the voice and walked out of her chambers to prepare for the trials ahead. And she told herself that tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, she would find the limit of human endurance. Tomorrow she would make Marcus Cole meal. But Deep in her heart, she felt something she had never felt before any trial in her entire life: doubt. The medical bay aboard the human diplomatic vessel Steady Hand was not designed for situations like this. But the doctors were doing their best with what they had. Marcus Cole sat on a treatment bed while a medic applied regenerative gel to the burns on his face and arms. And Captain Torres stood nearby with an expression that mixed concern with something that looked almost like awe. "The Sithrani have accelerated the remaining trials," Torres said. "And they want you back in the arena in 6 hours. Marcus winced as the gel touched a particularly nasty blister on his cheek. "That seems fast." "It is fast, and it breaks every protocol in the book. But apparently, the Queen has the authority to modify the trial schedule at her discretion." "Sounds like she's upset." Torres let out a short laugh that had no humor in it. "Upset is an understatement. And our intelligence contacts say she's been screaming at her advisors for the past 3 hours. Marcus shrugged with one shoulder. "Well, I guess I better get some sleep then." The medic looked at him like he had just announced plans to juggle live grenades. "Sir, you have second-degree burns over 30% of your body, and your core temperature was over 41 degrees when they pulled you out of that chamber. And you should be in intensive care right now." "But I'm not in intensive care," Marcus said calmly. "And I have more trials to do, so let's focus on getting me functional." He closed his eyes and was asleep within 30 seconds. And the medic and the captain looked at each other with identical expressions of disbeliefs. 6 hours later, Marcus Cole walked back into the arena beneath Station Valthrix. And if his movements were a little stiff and his face was a little pale, he showed no other sign of the damage he had suffered. Queen Zirvedis was already waiting for him, and her compound eyes tracked his approach with the intensity of a predator watching prey. "You should have stayed in your medical bay," she said as he took his position across from her. "Probably," Marcus agreed. "But then I would miss all this excitement." The first trial of the day was called the Trial of Pain, and it involved a device that attached to the nervous system and stimulated pain receptors with increasing intensity. The sensation started as a mild tingling and escalated through levels that had made warriors from a dozen species scream for mercy. And the trial ended when the subject either yielded or lost consciousness. Marcus sat in the chair and let the technicians attach the electrodes to his temples and spine, and he closed his eyes as the device hummed to. Life level 1 felt like being poked with a sharp stick. Level 2 felt like being stung by 100 bees at once. Level 3 felt like someone was dragging a knife across every inch of his skin. Level 4 felt like fire and acid and broken glass all mixed together and poured directly into his brain. Marcus gripped the arms of the chair and his jaw clenched so hard that his teeth creaked. But his eyes stayed closed and his mouth stayed shut. Level 5 was supposed to be the breaking point for most species. And the pain became something beyond description. It was not a sensation anymore. It was a reality. It was everything. And somewhere in the middle of that everything, Marcus Cole found a small, quiet place in his mind. Where the pain could not reach, he thought about his mother's kitchen and the smell of bacon frying on Sunday mornings. He thought about his first car and how proud he had been when he finally got it running after 6 months of work. He thought about the stars outside his window on the Steady Hand and how beautiful they looked when he was alone in the cargo bay at night. The pain was still there. He could feel it trying to tear him apart, but it was not him. It was just something happening to his body, and his body was not where he kept the important stuff. Level 6 and the technicians began to look nervous. Level 7 and Queen Zirvedis leaned forward in her seat. Level 8 and Marcus Cole opened his eyes and looked directly at the Queen. "Ma'am," he said through gritted teeth, "I've passed kidney stones that hurt worse than this, and are we doing this or not?" The arena erupted in chaos as the observers tried to understand what they were seeing. And the Queen's advisors rushed to check the equipment because surely something must be malfunctioning. But nothing was malfunctioning, the human was simply refusing to break. The second trial was the trial of fear. And it involved a psychic projection chamber that reached into the subject's mind and manifested their deepest and most primal terror creatures from other species had faced projections of cosmic voids and ancient predators and the death of their entire civilization. And the Queen was curious to see what a human feared most. Marcus entered the chamber, and the psychic field activated. And the walls began to shimmer as the projection tried to find form. Nothing happened. The chamber hummed and flickered and struggled to render anything at all. And the technicians exchanged confused glances, because this had never happened before. After 3 full minutes, the projection finally stabilized. And what appeared in the chamber made Queen Zirvethis wonder if the equipment had broken. After all, it was a stack of papers. Just papers sitting on a desk under a flickering light with a sign above them that read, "Supply requisition forms urgent." Marcus looked at the projection and burst out laughing. "Yeah," he said between laughs. "That tracks, and I have about 300 of those waiting for me back on the ship." The Queen stared at him with her mandibles hanging open. His greatest fear was paperwork. His greatest fear was paperwork. The third trial was the trial of isolation, and it involved spending 72 hours in a sensory deprivation pod with no light and no sound and no sensation of any kind. The purpose was to break the mind through absolute emptiness. And subjects often emerged screaming about things they had seen in the darkness of their own thoughts. Marcus climbed into the pod and the door sealed behind him. And the observers settled in to wait 72 hours later. The door opened and the medical team rushed forward to assess the subject. Marcus Cole was asleep, not catatonic, not comatose asleep. He opened his eyes as the light hit his face and yawned with the satisfaction of a man who had just enjoyed a very restful nap. "That was great," he said as he climbed out of the pod. "And that's the best sleep I've had in weeks. And does anyone have any coffee?" Queen Zirvethis stood at the edge of the arena and watched this human stretch his arms above his head like he had just woken up from a pleasant afternoon in the sun. And she felt something crack inside her chest. It was not her body. It was her certainty. She had been so sure that humans were weak. She had been so sure that their softness made them vulnerable. But she was beginning to understand that she had made a terrible mistake. Humans were not soft. Humans were made of something else entirely. Something that did not break no matter how hard you hit it. Something that took everything you threw at it and shrugged and asked if you had anything better. Something that terrified her in a way that no enemy ever had before. Because you could kill a strong enemy. You could outsmart a clever enemy. You could outlast a patient enemy. But what did you do with an enemy who simply refused to acknowledge that they were supposed to be defeated? The Queen looked at Marcus Cole, and she knew that there was only one trial left, the trial of combat. And for the first time in her life, she was not certain she would win. The arena had never been so crowded in living memory, and representatives from every known species had packed into the viewing galleries to witness what everyone was calling the most remarkable proving in galactic history. The small human who worked in logistics had somehow survived every trial the Sithrani could throw at him. And now he was about to face the Queen herself. In single combat, Queen Zirvethis stood at one end of the fighting circle, wearing her ceremonial armor and feeling the weight of her ancestors watching from whatever afterlife the Sithrani believed in. She had never lost a fight. She had killed champions and crushed warlords and broken the bodies of creatures twice her size. And her name was spoken with fear across 12 star systems. But today she felt something unfamiliar in her chest. Today she felt doubt. Marcus Cole walked into the arena wearing the same gray uniform he had worn throughout the proving, and his face still showed the fading marks of burns from the crucible trial. He had no armor, he had no weapons, he had nothing except his body and whatever strange thing lived inside his mind that allowed him to endure things that should have destroyed him. The rules of the trial of combat were simple as the announcer explained. No weapons, allowed no assistance from outside the circle. The fight continued until one combatant yielded or was unable to continue. There were no other rules. Queen Zirvethis looked at the human standing across from her, and she spoke for the first time. Since the trials began, you have surprised me. Marcus Cole of Earth. Thank you, ma'am. But this trial will be different. Because in this trial, I will not be testing your endurance, and I will be breaking your body with my own hands. Marcus nodded like she had just told him about the weather. I understand. You cannot win this fight, and you must know that. And so I offer you one chance to yield with dignity before I am forced to hurt you. The human tilted his head slightly to one side. That's kind of you, but I think I'll pass. The queen's mandibles clicked with something that might have been frustration or might have been respect. So be it. She moved before the signal was given, and her speed was terrifying for a creature her size. One moment, she was standing across the circle, and the next moment her fist was connecting with Marcus Cole's chest with enough force to send him flying backward. Through the air he hit the ground hard and slid across the stone floor until he came to rest at the edge of the circle. And for a moment, everyone in the arena thought it was over. Then Marcus Cole stood up. He pressed one hand against his chest where the blow had landed, and he took a moment to catch his breath. And then he walked back to the center of the circle and raised his hands in a fighting stance that looked almost comical compared to the queen's. Trained martial posture as a Vethis hit him again and again and again. She threw him into pillars and slammed him against the ground, and struck him with blows that would have killed members of most species. And every single time Marcus Cole stood back up, his left arm broke with a crack that echoed through the silent arena. And he stood back up, his ribs cracked under the force of a kick that lifted him off his feet. And he stood back up, blood ran from cuts on his face, and his body was covered in bruises that were already turning dark purple. And he stood back up. 20 minutes into the fight, Queen Zirvethis was breathing hard. And it was not from physical exertion, it was from something she had never experienced before. It was from the terrible realization that she could not make this human stay down. She could break every bone in his body. She could reduce him to a bleeding ruin that could barely stand, but she could not make him stop. Why? She demanded as Marcus swayed on his feet in front of her. Why will you not stay down? He spat blood onto the ground and looked up at her with those ash-gray eyes that had haunted her since the first trial. Because you haven't beaten me yet. I have broken your body. Yeah, he agreed in a voice that was rough with pain. But that's not where I keep the important stuff. Queen Zirvethis stared at this broken human who could barely stand and yet refused to fall. And she felt something shift inside her. She had spent her entire life believing that strength meant the ability to destroy. She had conquered worlds and crushed armies and built an empire on the broken bodies of those who opposed her. But standing before her now was a creature who had no strength by any measure she understood. And yet he was the most dangerous opponent she had ever faced, because you could not defeat someone who refused to acknowledge defeat. You could not break someone who treated their own body as an inconvenience rather than a limitation. You could not conquer a species that had looked at a hostile universe and decided that it would keep going anyway, not because it was strong enough to win, but because it was too stubborn to lose. The queen lowered her hands. The arena fell absolutely silent. I withdraw my challenge, she announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the massive space. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs, and the queen's own advisors looked at her like she had lost her mind. "My queen," one of them called out. "You cannot simply withdraw. I can do whatever I choose," she replied without taking her eyes off Marcus. "Because I am the queen." She stepped forward until she was standing directly in front of the battered human, and she looked down at him with an expression that no one in the arena could read. "I withdraw not because you have defeated me," she said, "but because I understand now that you cannot be defeated, and not in any way that matters. Because you will simply continue no matter what I do to you." She turned to face the assembled ambassadors and dignitaries. "Let it be known throughout the galaxy that humanity has passed the proving. And they have not passed through might or through cunning or through any quality that we traditionally respect." She paused. "They have passed through something else entirely, and I do not have a word for it in my language." Marcus wobbled on his feet, and his crewmates rushed forward to catch him before he fell. And Captain Torres grabbed one arm while a Marine grabbed the other. "Human," the Queen called out as they began to help him. Toward the exit, Marcus turned his head to look at her. "What do your people call that quality? That thing you carry inside you that makes you refuse to stop?" Marcus considered the question for a moment, and despite the pain and the exhaustion, his cracked and bleeding lips curved into a small smile. "Spite. Mostly," he said. He paused, "but we dress it up and call it hope." Queen Zerithis watched the humans leave the arena, and she felt the weight of every ambassador's eyes on her. Back, she had been humiliated, she had been defeated, she had been forced to admit that everything she thought she knew about strength and weakness was wrong. But as she stood alone in the center of the fighting circle, she realized that she did not feel angry anymore. She felt something else, something that might have been the beginning of respect. 3 months later, the Sithrani Dominion signed its first mutual defense treaty with Earth, and Queen Zerithis personally requested that Marcus Cole serve as the human liaison to her court. When her advisors asked her why she would want a constant reminder of her defeat, she gave an answer that confused them all. "I wish to understand a species that considers suffering to be a personal insult rather than a truth to be accepted," she said. "Because they are either the wisest beings in the galaxy or most foolish." She paused. "I suspect they are both. And that is precisely what makes them dangerous." The treaty was signed in a ceremony, attended by representatives from across the galaxy, and Marcus Cole stood beside Queen Zerithis as the documents were exchanged. As the cameras flashed and the diplomats applauded, the Queen leaned down to speak quietly to the human beside her. "Tell me something, Marcus Cole." "Yes, ma'am." "Do all humans possess this quality you call spite?" Marcus thought about it for a moment. "Pretty much. Yeah, and some of us just hide it better than others." The Queen's mandibles spread in what he had learned to recognize as a Queen's mandibles spread in what he had learned to recognize as a Zola. Sithrani smile. "Then I believe the galaxy is not prepared for what humanity will become." Marcus shrugged. "Probably not. But we're pretty good at surprising people." He smiled up at her with his plain face and his ash-gray eyes. "It's kind of our thing,